Visual perception. To receive information from the environment, we are equipped with sense organs. For example, our eyes, ears, and nose. Each sense organ is a part of a sensory system that receives sensory inputs and transmits sensory information to the brain. A particular problem for psychologists is explaining how the physical energy received by the sense organs forms the basis for perceptual experience. Sensory inputs are somehow converted into perceptions of desks and computers, flowers and buildings, cars and planes, into sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and touch experiences. A major theoretical issue on which psychologists are divided is the extent to which perception relies directly on the information present in the environment. Some argue that perceptual processes are not direct but depend on the perceiver's expectations and previous knowledge as well as the information available in the stimulus itself. This controversy is discussed with respect to Gibson, who has proposed a direct theory of perception, which is a bottom up theory, and Gregory, who has proposed a constructivist or indirect theory of perception, which is a top down theory. Psychologists distinguish between the two processes in perception, bottom up and top down. Bottom up processing is also known as data driven processing because perception begins with the stimulus itself. Processing is carried out in one direction from the retina to the visual cortex, with each successive stage in the visual pathway carrying out an ever more complex analysis of the input. Whereas top down processing refers to the use of contextual information in pattern recognition. For example, understanding difficult handwriting is easier when reading complete sentences than reading single and isolated words. This is because the meaning of the surrounding words provides a context to aid the understanding. Let us understand Gregory's top down processing. Psychologist Richard Gregory argued that perception is a constructive process that relies on top down processing. Stimulus information from our environment is frequently ambiguous, so to interpret it, we require higher cognitive information either from past experiences or stored knowledge in order to make inferences about what we perceive. Helmholtz called it the likelihood principle. For Gregory, perception is a hypothesis which is based on prior experience. In this way, we are actively constructing our perception of reality based on our environment and our stored information. A lot of information reaches the eye, but much is lost by the time it reaches the brain. Gregory estimates about 90% is lost. Therefore, the brain has to guess what a person is seeing based on past experiences. We actively construct our perception of reality. Richard Gregory proposed that perception involves a lot of hypothesis testing to make sense of the information presented to the sense organs. Our perceptions of the world are hypotheses based on past experiences and stored information. Sensory receptors receive information from the environment, which is then combined with previously stored information about the world, which we have built up as a result of experience. The formation of incorrect hypotheses will lead to errors of perception. For example, visual illusions like the Necker cube. Highly unlikely objects tend to be mistaken for likely objects. This is an evidence which supports Gregory's theory. Gregory has demonstrated this with a hollow mask of a face. Such a mask is generally seen as normal even when one knows and feels the real mask. There seems to be an overwhelming need to reconstruct the face, similar to Helmholtz's description of unconscious inference, an assumption based on past experience. Perceptions can be very ambiguous. The Necker cube is a good example of this. When you stare at the crosses on the cube, the orientation can suddenly change or flip. Gregory argued that this object appears to flip between orientations because brain develops two equally plausible hypotheses and is unable to decide between them. When the perception changes, though there is no change in the sensory input, the change of appearance cannot be due to bottom up processing. It must be set downwards by the prevailing perceptual hypothesis of what is near and what is far. If we evaluate Gregory's theory, we understand that perceptions make use of hypothesis testing. So the question can be asked what kind of hypothesis they are. Scientists modify a hypothesis according to the support they find for it. So are we, as perceivers, also able to modify our hypothesis? And in some cases, the answer would be yes. A perplexing question for constructivists who propose perception is essentially top down in nature is how can the neonate ever perceive? If we all have to construct our own worlds based on past experiences, why are our perceptions so similar even across cultures? The constructivist approach stresses the role of knowledge in perception and therefore is against the nativist approach to perceptual development. Another theory proposed is by Gibson. Gibson's bottom up theory suggests that perception involves innate mechanisms forged by evolution and that no learning is required. This suggests that perception is necessary for survival. Without perception, we would live in a very dangerous environment. Our ancestors would have needed perception to escape from harmful predators, suggesting that perception is evolutionary. James Gibson argues that perception is direct and not subject to hypothesis testing, as Gregory proposed. There is enough information in our environment to make sense of the world in a very direct way. His theory is sometimes known as the ecological theory because of the claim that perception can be explained solely in terms of the environment. For Gibson, the sensation is perception itself. What you see is what you get. There is no need for processing or interpretation, as the information we receive about size, shape, distance, etc. is sufficiently detailed for us to interact directly with the environment. Gibson argued that perception is a bottom up process, which means that sensory information is analyzed in one direction, from simple analysis of raw sensory data to the ever increasing complexity of analysis through the visual system. What are the features of Gibson's theory? The starting point for Gibson's theory was that the pattern of light reaching the eye, known as the optic array, containing all visual information necessary for perception. This optic array provides unambiguous information, clear information about the layout of objects in the space. Light rays reflect off surfaces and converge into the cornea of your eye. Perception involves picking up the rich information provided by the optic array in a direct way with little or no processing involved. Because of movement and different intensities of light shining in different directions, it is an ever changing source of sensory information. Therefore, if you move, the structure of optic array changes. According to Gibson, we have mechanisms to interpret this unstable sensory input, meaning we experience a stable and meaningful view of the world. Changes in the flow of the optic array contain important information about what type of movement is taking place. The flow of the optic array will either move from or towards a particular point. If the flow appears to be coming from the point, it means you are moving towards it. If the optic array is moving towards the point, you are moving away from it. The optic array contains invariant information that remains constant as the observer moves. Invariants are aspects of environment that don't change. Let's evaluate Gibson's theory. Gibson's theory is a highly ecologically valid theory as it puts perception back into the real world. A large number of applications can be applied in terms of his theory. For example, training pilots, runway markings, and road markings. So, to conclude our point, which processing actually happens, bottom up or top down? Neither direct nor constructivist theories of perception seem capable of explaining all perceptions all of the time. Gibson's theory appears to be based on perceivers operating under ideal viewing conditions, where stimulus information is plentiful and is available for a suitable length of time. Constructivist theories like Gregory's have typically involved viewing under less than ideal conditions. Research by Tulving and others manipulated both the clarity of the stimulus input and the impact of the perceptual context in a word identification task. As the clarity of the stimulus through exposure duration and the amount of context increased, so did the likelihood of correct identification. However, as the exposure duration increased, so the impact of context was reduced, suggesting that if stimulus information is high, then the need to use other sources of information is reduced. One theory that explains how top-down and bottom-up processes may be seen as interacting with each other to produce the best interpretation of the stimulus was proposed by Neisser, known as the perceptual cycle. Thank you so much for listening.